Hello and welcome to the Cuyamaga Institute, our Q&A conversation for exploration series. I'm Paul Robert, the Executive Director and President of the Institute, and along with my wife, Laura Lee, the Director of Research, Education, and Outreach. And on behalf of our Board of Directors, advisors, volunteers, and supporting members, we want to thank you for joining us today. The Cuyamaga Institute is an independent, nonprofit research organization committed to researching consciousness and the human experience following the footsteps of our founder, anthropologist Dr. Felicitas Goodman. And as an educational institution, we take an open approach, and we invite scholars in related fields to help broaden the scope of our own work and exploration, and that's why we call this Conversation for Exploration. On these weekly Sunday discussions, we've had a full spectrum of topics from neuroscience, anthropology, archaeology, archaeoastronomy, ecology, philosophy, psychology, mythology, shamanism, rituals, hero's journey. It goes on and on and on.
From the arts to the sciences.
And you're welcome to join us at our website at cuyamagainstitute.com. All of our presentations are free. And as a nonprofit, of course, we invite you to become a supporting member. And we want to thank you, the community members, who continue to support the mission of the Cuyamaga Institute. Today we're excited to welcome our guest, Bruce Bernstein. He's a museum professional, an anthropologist, ethnologist, and curator, an arts and cultural specialist with the experience in museums, cultural organizations, and tribal planning. Bruce has been dedicated for over 30 years or 3 decades of work with museums, modeling new partnerships and working directly with Indigenous artists and permanent collections of traditional arts. He served as the assistant director of the National Museum of American Indian at the Smithsonian Institution, and he was the director of the Museum of Indian Arts in Santa Fe, and much, much more. Huge amount of credentials. But currently he serves as the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Pueblo of Powake, which is the neighbor of us at the Cuyamaga Institute. And that's how I met Bruce. I met Bruce about 8 years ago, when we were partnering to further protect and document the ancestral history of the village that resides on the land of the Cuyamaga Institute. And along with Scott Ortman, the archaeologist from the University of Colorado, Bruce also representing the Pueblo of Powake, we were able to come up with amazing detailed history, which was mapped and documented.
And Scott was here a month or so ago.
We talked to Scott just recently, so you'll want to see that presentation as well.
Yeah.
In today's world, museums are making a significant shift to properly acknowledge and include Native peoples in all aspects of its preservation, what and what not to display, and sometimes return the culturally significant artifacts to the original tribal people.
I think this is such an important shift for museums to include the voice and the knowledge of the very people whose artifacts they're collecting and showing. We love art, artifacts, architecture, exploring ancient sites, the books, the legends, the stories, the conversations. I love the natural world and all of nature's wonders, from the macro to the microcosm. And we also love to explore the material culture that collectively, the world over, humanity has created in response to our world. Our history, our evolutionary journey, our passage through life, its joys, its challenges, what it means. So yes, we love all of this. We love that there's so much online, certainly to partake of, but also there's something so magical about wandering through and gazing upon face to face the artifacts, the art. I consider museums to be modern day cathedrals, a place to pause, reflect, consider anew who we are, where we've been, where we're going. In our travels, in addition to ancient sites, we always book days to go see the local museums, wherever we are. And, we're there from opening to closing. Yeah. We've learned to gear up like we would for a safari, the hiking shoes, the water, the power snacks. I mean, we spend all day to see everything.
Yeah. We went to the British Museum and spent a
We
week.
spent a week to see every museum we could there. You know, we go not just to the Louvre, we go to the Quai Branly, we go, you know, outside
In
Paris to go
right.
to the National Archaeology Museum that takes, you know, a major train ride to go. I mean, we see them all.
Yeah.
Right? Modern to ancient. So there's just so much to appreciate about museums and bookstores, especially used bookstores, right? And conversations. So I appreciate this shifting relationship that museums have with the viewers. I appreciate people like our guest Bruce Bernstein today, who's really steering that to include the voices of the ancestors, right? The descendants, the actual cultures and their representatives, from the collecting to the curating to the presentation to the housing to where they're housed. It's about making the stories, which is the key gift of these artifacts, more collaborative, more participatory, more meaningful, and and who would know better than anyone, right, what these mean. So welcome, Bruce. Glad to have you here. Thanks for all the work that you're doing. So tell us how you got even started. What is your personal passion? What is the quest that you've been on? How did you end up, and how did you happen to be where you've been, and where are you now in all of this?
Well, first of all, good morning. Good morning to you all. Thanks for spending some of your Sunday with us. And thank you, Laura Lee and Paul, for friendship over the years and allowing us to explore part of the land that you steward right now. I was thinking and trying to figure out where the passion comes from. I think that there's nothing in my background that suggests that I would be doing this or should be doing this. My father was in construction. Both my parents are children of immigrants following the horrific pogroms in Eastern Europe. So there's really not a whole lot, and it wasn't particularly religious home in any way. But I began looking at collections. I had an opportunity my second year as an undergrad to begin to work in museums. And it was quite extraordinary. And I did the normal thing. I looked at books and tried to find things in books. And I just found the books had conflated so much or confused so much, or didn't know as much as I would like. So I decided to go and talk to people and talk to basket weavers, in particular in the Central Valley of California and out towards the coast north of San Francisco. And many people were so generous and open with me. It was extraordinary. One of the things that happened, is it was a different time for museum collections, and I was working with a very large collection, and I took a few baskets and put them in the back of my car, and I drove them up about an hour north of where we were working. And I wanted to show these baskets to a woman I was working with at the time. And we had been talking about her relatives and who wove and who didn't weave. And as I walked into her house, just crossing the threshold of the door, she said, "Oh, Aunt Nora, she never could put her feathers in straight." And we referenced to the basket I was holding. So I began to wonder about what Bertha saw and how she was able to unravel the basket and reweave it all at the same time. And we began talking about those things and these sort of what we would call diagnostic features, the way that the look of the basket overall, but its materials and thought processes and everything that goes into it. And as I began working with other people, I worked with Bertha and her family. It was an extraordinary privilege. And it has been, I've had a very privileged life in terms of what I've been able to do. And I began to think about what my role in that world might be. I did not for a moment think that I could be converted, and I understood that very clearly. And but what would a white guy do in the Native world, possibly? And I really began to think about being more of a facilitator and facilitating conversation, opening doors, making space for voices that have been excluded. Those voices were already in the museum collections, and they were in the objects and things that people had made and so forth. but they had been sort of muted, let's just say. My role was to amplify them, and make sure people heard those voices. And so when I began to think about the sort of tools I needed, one of the tools that I needed was a degree, a PhD. And I'd not done anthropology as an undergrad. It was not something I thought much of in terms of the problems that anthropology had caused for Indigenous peoples around the world, but certainly I was thinking of North America. And I began to think about my audience as being more anthropology than anybody else. So I did the degree in anthropology. I was very fortunate. I went to University of New Mexico. I had looked around for a native faculty, and there was like almost none. But Alfonso Ortiz, who was from Okiawinge, which is just north of Santa Fe, was at UNM. And I really focused in on working with Alfonso. As it turned out, I was his teaching assistant. He chaired my committee. He was an extraordinary influence on everything that I was thinking of, and put order to it in a matter of speaking. One of the things he always said was, good anthropology is uncovering the systems that are there instead of overlaying new systems.
Ah, makes sense.
Thinking about that in terms of working with people to reveal those systems, or bring those systems forward, bring their voice forward, bring their worldviews forward, as you would say, Laura Lee, your consciousness forward. Because in these pieces, whether it's a piece of pottery, whatever, it's always about people's consciousness and their history, it's their narrative. So how would you do that? And in a number of very fortunate museum positions, I had the opportunity to do some of these things. I was at the Wheelwright Museum for about 3 years in Santa Fe, and we were going to put an exhibition for contemporary artists into the museum. And I told the exhibit designer that she was going to design and curate the exhibit, and he basically said, "Well, I quit," because he didn't believe that this Native woman, who is still a very strong intellect and vision person, could possibly curate anything on her own, and didn't see his role facilitating, but he saw his role as telling her what to do and how to organize her artwork. It was a successful exhibit. I don't think he ever talked to me again, but that's something else. Let's leave that alone.
That's the old dinosaurs dying out.
I had the same opportunity at the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture, Laboratory of Anthropology here in Santa Fe. I was hired to fix the museum. They had built a new building a year before my arrival, which was very problematic for lots of reasons. And they hadn't really used the collections. No one was using the historic and contemporary collections. So we did a series of exhibitions over the 10 years I was there, leading up to a permanent exhibition, Here, Now, and Always. But one of those exhibitions we did early on was something called Steady Hands, White Metal. Steady Hands, White Metal was about jewelry, silver and turquoise jewelry in particular, and looking at historic and contemporary. So I asked 2 jewelers to come in and curate the show. And the sort of resistance that one got in these types of things, I took this fantastic collection that the museum has, and I took it out of where it was being stored, literally stored in plastic bags and so on. And I laid it all out on tables, eight tables, eight 8-foot tables, folding tables. And one of the employees came in and said, "Why are you doing that? They're not going to care about any of that." That set the tone for that person, definitely. And it was never very pleasant. But she didn't see where Native people had anything to contribute. So in this exhibition, they certainly had a lot to contribute. And in a different way, we did a From This Earth exhibition, which was about Pueblo pottery. And a lot of different people. It was a huge 400 pieces of pottery. It was a sort of plug-in place, disastrous part of the museum, a big, huge atrium with glass windows that were installed backwards. There had been planter boxes, first a mice infestation, then a bug infestation. So we wanted to put something that was inorganic, that wouldn't be harmed by all the failings of the architecture and building. So we put this pottery in, and it was my extraordinary privilege to work with Red Lake Ojibwe man, John Garrigan. And John had been the curator of photography at the Modern Museum in New York. He had come to Santa Fe. And as he designed the show, he really asked me some complicated questions about presentation and how talking to people, and just the entire what the look of the show, what the design of the exhibition was, and how that feeling is the emotive part of the work, that people would feel it was theirs. Pueblo people would feel the pottery was theirs. And one of the things I'll never forget, he asked, we were looking at photographs to put in one section, and there was a photograph taken from the corner of, excuse me, there was a photograph taken from the corner of Palace in Lincoln, looking up the side of the Palace of the Governors. And people were selling, it was Indian market in the 50s. The sun was beating on them. It looked very uncomfortable. And I said to John, I really don't think we should use this photograph. People look so uncomfortable. And he looked at me and he just said, that's the point. People need to see what Native people are feeling and understanding. I'll just never forget that moment. It's very vivid in my mind always, in terms of showing the truth and talking about the truth. On the basis of the work I did in Santa Fe, I was hired part of the founding senior management staff of the National Museum of American Indian Smithsonian. And I had a very large section of the museum. We built a building for collections and research. We had a 5-year project to move the collections from a warehouse in the Bronx to the new facility in Washington, D.C. I architected I don't know if that's a verb, but it is now. I served as the architect for the opening exhibits, worked on the opening exhibits and some other exhibits. We instituted a contemporary arts program. We really looked for ways to bring Native voice into the museum. If anyone in the audience has followed NMAI, they know that those opening exhibits were not what people expected. People expected war bonnets and wash blossoms. They expected not to have Kiowa people speak about who they are and what they wanted to present to the world. Now I think the exhibits would be more acceptable. I think just 20 years ago, it was very complicated for people to really believe that, or take a moment to leave their belief systems to the side and focus on what people were telling them. So through all this work, again, I've been very fortunate, but one of the main things is learning how to listen and hear what people are saying. Not be intrusive. I think all work that I do needs to be respectful and responsible, and it needs to be returnable and useful. In other words, anything I say here, I could say in front of a community gathering. I don't think there's any difference in terms of those things. Anything I write needs to be accessible in some way. And I do think, in working with the Pueblo Pewaukee, which is my 11th year working with the Pueblo, it's been an amazing opportunity and honor to work with the community. And so I shifted from working on behalf of people to working for people. So it's just a total mind shift. And it's just been wonderful to mature some of my thinking and clarify some of my thinking. Certainly showing where the holes in my thinking are and what I might do or cannot do to fill those holes. But in working
about the right man at the right moment for the
I
right
don't know. Just, whatever that might be. Anyways, so those are kind of, and so I've ended up at Pewaukee, the governor of the time at the time, George Rivera, who I'd known for a long time. George asked me to come up to Pewaukee, meaning from Santa Fe, to work. And he asked me to do 3 things. He asked me to build a nonprofit foundation, which we did. And I turned that over to the Pueblo about 3 or 4 years ago. That was a Continuous Pathways Foundation. And that's still going, and I think very successful. One of the side offshoots of it is the Lightning Boy Foundation about hoop dancing. This had a big event in Santa Fe this weekend. And then he asked me to work with the Tribal Museum, the Poe Center. He asked me to work with the Tribal Museum and to make it more about Pewaukee. It had done great things and put this artist and really done terrific work, but it was often lacking for getting people in the village, Milwaukee Village, interested, as well as the other Tewa villages. What would they say? So I began looking at this idea of what's useful in anthropology, what's useful in museums. Like Laura Lee was saying, that museums have not been pleasant places for people, nor is anthropology very pleasant. And if any of you have been written about in the newspaper or interviewed and then read what they've written about you, and you wonder if they really talk to you or not. And I know that many people have thought that. I think also that the things that people have written have been inappropriate. Sometimes they weren't meant to be in writing, but they were meant as part of the generosity of people and the sharing of people. So learning where those boundaries are and how you might learn something that is far beyond what you're trying to do, and listen and understand that enough that you leave that to the side, or find a way to, in a very oblique way, incorporate it, which is a lot of my work. Sometimes is that, and that way when the village reads it, they know that they know that I know something that is about what I'm writing about. This is a bad sentence, but they know that I left it out of respect for them, that I am working closely with them. And so at the Poe Center, we developed some programs and began to look at the Pueblo. I looked through museum collections and traveled and found Milwaukee collections every place. We visited those places. It took me about 2 years to get the governor, George Rivera, and lieutenant governor at that time, Joe Talachi, in Washington at the same time. And so they were there. We took a day, we looked at the Smithsonian collections. And this idea that I'd had for quite a while, which was to bring back Tewa pottery. In the 100, it was just a round number. There was nothing more to that than a round number. And to situate it in the Poe Center for cultural learning and language instruction, as well as inspiration. And they've done that now, and those are there. And so I end up then as the last thing he asked me to do was the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer.
Yeah.
And begin to get a handle on the ancestral, historic, and contemporary places on the Pueblo's lands and adjoining lands that have a lot to do with the village. And part of the valley is filled with lots of people from lots of places. Milwaukee is about 550 people on 13,000 acres. So they have been historically bounded by lines, but that little corner of the valley, which is certainly theirs, culturally speaking, the entire valley is and remains part of Milwaukee's heritage, that they still use those places throughout.
Yeah.
Well, and also the Nambe and the Tasuke as well.
Right.
We have 3 neighbors there. But I want to say that we were recently at the Post Center and saw its renovation and upgrades, and saw
The
many
return
of
of the 100
pots.
pots.
Yeah.
But just absolutely magnificent.
Yeah, so it's really, for a tiny museum, it has a lot and it tells its story so well. But I also want to say what I appreciate about George Rivera, who, by the way, the founder of our institute, Felicitas Goodman, was one of his first patrons when he graduated from our school.
19-year-old
Yeah,
kid.
yeah. So we have a long relationship with George. But is that you walk around the corner and there are workshops for the young Pohake members to do their art. Right? He's actively encouraging and creating a space for these young artists. And I also have to say that what I really appreciate about that is the ancient art with its vernacular, its transition into modern art. You can see the lineage of it, the new modern expression of it, the current, what it has to say. It's just so, it's wonderful to behold that from the old to the new. And to see it translated
Contemporary
into that.
native.
It's exciting. It's exciting to see that.
Yeah.
So
the
anyway.
Poe Center really has served as a community center where, like you're saying,
Yeah.
the youngsters can come in and be trained and take classes and participate and learn about their own heritage.
And you can walk around the corner and talk to them. Their doors are open. That's fun. So
Part of George's vision for the Poe Center, as they began to look around for out of the sort of planning phase and into the actionable or implementation, he saw that lots of Native communities always had vocational training. And the vocational training was, in a very direct way, prejudicial in terms of allowing people to work with their hands. They're sort of bottom rung jobs and so forth. So vocational training, auto mechanics, and house painting, those types of things. And there was money in programs for vocational training. So what George saw, his vision was to have vocational training in people's own art systems of making art. And that was the origin of jewelry and sculpture, pottery studios, and they're still ongoing. The vocational money has dried up a few years ago, but they're finding other monies to keep these projects going and have great instructors, terrific instructors. And now those classes are for young people. There's no doubt about it, but there is this diaspora of Native people. And as they come home, even in retirement or finishing with jobs elsewhere, there's a lot of those people who come into the Po to learn something about making pottery in their own heritage. And one of the great values of it is, as you're making pottery, you're sitting with other Native people, Tewa people, and you're just talking about families and things. There's a great deal to learn, just working in the clay together.
Yeah. So, what an interesting history. You've certainly fulfilled your original mission, haven't you? So, yeah. Tell us about cultural appreciation versus appropriation, because you talked about the jewelry. We've even seen comments that, well, you shouldn't be wearing, the new woke culture, you shouldn't be wearing native jewelry. That's appropriation. Come on, they're trying to make a living. That is their vocation. That's what they want to do, is sell their wear. Where is that line? Because that's a very big issue. It always has been. Appreciation versus appropriation. That is shifting. Yeah.
That's a really good question and complicated. So you have the Native arts world that produces things that people wear and have in their homes and so forth. And one of the great things about Native arts is that it is a communicator. It's a bridge. It's the way people get together. So Santa Fe has this thing called Indian Market that's coming up in a few weeks. It's a great family reunion, and people who have bought from certain individuals, their families have come together. They're now second, third generation, still friends with those families. So it's a great way that people come together. And I don't think anyone denies that part of the Native art world, or the fact that the Native art world has produced so much. And each time somebody has a pot in particular, the way the potters talk about clay and making pottery is birthing a child. Man or woman, they're still birthing that child. So can you imagine how the bravery, the courage involved in creating a child and then selling or giving that child to a white person, someone maybe you know or don't know, and they're going to take it back to Boston, Sedona, or Los Angeles, New York, wherever they're going to take it. They're going to take that piece of pottery, and they're going to take a little piece of you. It's going to be on the shelf in their home. And that's one of the extraordinary things. So we have a few things that people have given us over the years, and it's really the narratives. I mean, they're beautiful pieces, don't get me wrong, but it's really the narrative that's embedded in them, which is the conversations with those people, the reason why they may have gifted that particular piece and so forth. And I think many people get that on the Native art side. I think that's incredibly important. There are some people that make inappropriate things. There are people who appropriate other tribal histories and art forms, and there's a lot of that. There's a governmental organization called the Indian Arts and Crafts Board, where if you're going to claim something is Native or Indian made, you have to have a certain degree of Native blood or be a member of a recognized tribe in the United States. Otherwise, you can't advertise it as that. They also see that people, again, non-Native people, let's just say, make things, wear things. There's a huge powwow circuit for non-Native people in Europe and here in the United States. It's kind of an extraordinary thing. It is wonderful that people want to share with one another. I think having been working with people for quite a while, amongst people born in the late 19th, early 20th century, there was an openness, I should say. And what I mean by that openness was they were greatly concerned about all the people who had been driven away from their communities. Their families and community members were driven away by different ways. The government had programs to do that. So they're so happy that somebody was interested. And I find it's still true that people are very generous and so forth. And we just have to learn how to better manage our relationships with people and not assume that we're going to learn everything from them. One of the things about museums that's always bothered me is we put a case, a museum exhibition case up. So in this exhibit case, or one visit to a community, whatever it might be, people learn everything there is to know about that community, as if that community is as simple as that, or it doesn't have all the depth that any other culture has. So one of the things I really try to get people to think about is whatever museum shows and these exhibits and so forth, those are portals. Those are just doorways into complex thinking and consciousness and culture and so forth. And to think about things that way. Now, the appropriation on the other side is more about the things that museums have collected. Museums collected things that are appropriate and are great and fine. And museums at the same time collected things that were inappropriate or today are seen as inappropriate. Some of those things were made as replicas, like ceremonial things and so forth. Some are actual ceremonial things that people sold. And museum collectors took great advantage of Native communities. They took advantage of their being driven to such dirt poor conditions of drought and so forth. And took advantage of that by offering money for things. I think people also, that one of the things which is very complicated, but the older people who had these things, who were responsible for these ceremonies, the people who were supposed to take these ceremonies next, as an example, had been taken off to Indian schools, to boarding schools. And their grandparents and parents and other members of the community perhaps thought they wouldn't come back, or they weren't interested enough, or they were too changed. So there's that. But that person selling that object, and I've been told this a couple different times in different contexts, these museums are more like bank accounts. So you deposit it at some place where it would still be, and now people are withdrawing them and bringing them back into the communities. It's really extraordinary that way. One of the things to remember, a Zuni friend always reminded me that, that an object is a physical manifestation of the thought process. Mm. So you're not selling or giving your thought process to the museum, and no matter how hard the museum tries, it's not going to have that thought process and consciousness which is woven into or built into that particular piece. That is what's happening now, is there is a reuniting of intellect with object. And that reuniting, of course, is a wonderful circumstance. And that can be with what we call ceremonial material, but it's also just with pottery and families. I've been working on an exhibition and book project with some collaborators from San Ildefonso. We found certain potters' names and stuff like that, and put photographs of them, family histories with them and so forth. Those pots would never have as much life as that if it wasn't for those people. I would never have figured that out without them. And then knowing a little bit about those people, and it really begins to fill out the story of pottery for a community like San Ildefonso. Mm-hmm. So every object has a voice. People are generally not, I just misspoke. Many people are very upset that so much stuff is in the museum and they have nothing at home. And I don't blame them for that. And I think museums are trying very hard to return those things. There are inappropriate things like burials and shrines, the things that people take with them on their journey to the next world that have been unearthed, and they're sitting in museum shelves and in boxes. And that's a horrible circumstance that I'm working with a couple of communities right now and trying to get that to the right place where those things are returned and they're put back on their journeys. Not every community thinks that graves and shrines and things that have been disturbed can be restored and can be put back on their journey or put back into usefulness. So it depends who you're working with as far as some of that goes.
Can I go back to what the actual art means? It's a very different relationship to art from the native to our Western perspective. Art as a cultural repository, art as cultural identity, art as spiritual objects that have agency and meaning and purpose, very different from what we think of as art. Even the concept of beauty, right? Beauty being for us an aesthetic judgment, beauty for them being right relationship within a community, the flow of energy, the relationship one has to the universe at large. Can we talk about just that difference between the Western perspective of what art and artifacts are versus the native? Because I think that will help us understand that
Sure.
relationship better. We have to kind of, I mean, I'm stuck with a worldview and the culture I live in, but I don't agree with my cultural worldview. I don't agree with the Western worldview, first of all. I think we're missing so much of the equation. And so I think, as so many of us, our fascination, our attraction, our need to understand our ancestral heritage. We were once hunter-gatherers. We were once indigenous. That has been cut off at the knees for us in Western society through the vagaries of history. And there is a great need within us, many of us, to want to go back to a worldview that makes more sense, that is more coherent, that embraces the universe at large, that looks at the spiritual relationship, that looks at something larger than ourselves, right? This WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get, isn't the whole equation for so many of us. We are yearning for that connection. So please forgive us for wanting to go back to not just the Southwest or my part of the world, the Pacific Northwest, or truly the European ancestral.
The caves of Lascaux and all of that.
Yeah, but the world at large, right? I want to see all of the world's tapestry and heritage. We're all one family.
Human
So,
story.
I mean, if I can just put that on the table and go, that is why we're so fascinated, that is what we're yearning for. And I think that all of these cultures have something to tell us about a worldview that makes more sense. There you go. So how do we do that appropriately? How do we do that fully? How do we do that with participation? How do we show up and say, I want to connect. I want to connect with the larger family of man and its history. Because to pull back, right, to see all of that perspective can help us take better aim about where we're going. And believe me, it's one spaceship Earth. We're all in this journey together, and we better put our hearts and minds together to figure out where we're going for a future we can all agree on and be happy with. We all have that responsibility.
Well, we've talked about this, not with a big audience, just the two of us. And I think that a lot of people have that yearning for other cultures and to understand some of the deeper meanings of choices that we make. And then Euro-American cultures have been taught to ignore the sort of emotive side of things, the consciousness and so forth, to think in terms of Western culture more pragmatically or with an objective viewpoint, to leave behind some of these things. And there's been a movement over the years to do that because Native people may already have those things connected. People are attracted to Native communities, and I understand that. But you can't just enter a Native community and have that from them. We're talking about appropriation.
Right.
So if you go to a public dance, these are very generous events, and people have been preparing for it for a long time, for weeks and weeks. The songs and the dances, what people are wearing and so forth, are all carefully prepared and thought about. They carefully orchestrate the day as well. And on that day, they invite outsiders in. Again, this sort of generous spirit of Pueblo people in particular.
And invite you into their home and share a meal. I mean,
and yes,
what can you
absolutely.
be? Yeah.
And one of the great things about dances, and one of the things that Alfonso Ortiz taught me, who I talked about briefly in my opening comments, is that everything you want to know is in front of you. Their world is on display, so to speak. The narratives are there. We don't understand all the language or the dances and so forth. But if you're going to learn about these cultures, one of the things, a takeaway from my perspective is you don't learn everything. In the Pueblo culture, people don't sit you down and teach you things, but you learn by repetition and by observation. That's the world that you know. So why, as an anthropologist, could I possibly think that people are going to sit down and I could just take my notes and put it in a book and be complete? You just don't learn that way. And people don't explain things that way. So with 30 or so years working in the communities, someone might tell me something, or I might see something. Oh, I think I see that connection with this thing over here. As far as you kind of started with objects and what's inside them, and I do think people, everyone in their homes, have objects that have a great deal of meaning. And I think that's important to remember. If I went up to the Cuyamonga Institute today, and I took 10 things from the Cuyamonga Institute, you guys aren't there, your caretaker's walking the dog, and I just take these 10 things, and I decide I'm going to create an exhibition from them, and create an exhibition from those 10 things. I didn't expect you to come to the exhibition opening, but here you are, and you see how much I've missed in terms of talking about them. Sure, it's a bowl. Yeah, I can see that it's a bowl. But what is that bowl? Well, it's my grandmother's bowl that always had fruit in it when I visited her in her house. I was very fond of that grandmother. These are the things we did together. Well, I would never have that narrative about your grandmother in the bowl. I could certainly say it's a bowl to fiesta ware in 1932, this color, that, or this or that. And a lot of people mistake knowing about pottery the same way. Oh, that's a 1910 polychrome piece from San Ildefonso made by Ignacio Sanchez, let's just say. But that doesn't have any meaning on its own because it's not connected back into the culture itself, back into the families. So, I mean, you can see behind me, I have a few things around, obvious, like pictures of my children, right? I mean, so you get a sort of sense of things. But, what's this painting right here, right? This is by Mateo Romero, that painting. And it's originally a photograph by Edward Curtis. There's two women at Santa Clara. They're going to get water. They have water in the pots on their head. And one of the women is turned towards the camera and it's had a big old smile on her face. So what am I doing with that painting? That was for a project. We worked with a candy maker here in Santa Fe, and we made pottery and chocolates, and that was the cover of the box that
Can you grab it and show it to us a little clearly? It looks like it's, yeah, thank you.
Oh, yeah.
There you go. So Mateo took those women and created this for the front for the box in that way. So objects have a great deal of meaning, and then this top one and this one over here, this here. Someone Alfonso introduced me to, and someone I worked with for 40 years from one of the villages, and those are her paintings, and they're about her consciousness, about what she sees around her all the time, things that we may not be aware of. It's really quite extraordinary. So you see all that, and you begin to construct something, a narrative you think is accurate about me, maybe not accurate, I don't know. You can't see the rest of the room where I'm sitting, or you can see a stack of paper, wonder what I'm doing with that, right? Stacks of paper behind me, that's the book, here it is. But that's how we learn.
Our encounters are so few with
Well,
Native peoples.
Well,
You
what
rub shoulders on a
if
day-to-day basis. The rest of
yeah,
us, it's very limited access that we
yeah.
have for the most part.
But the aesthetic knowledge and understanding is one of the most universal of all human traits.
Yeah.
And everybody has it in some way. So somebody will go, oh, I don't know anything about art. I said, well, can you tell a Chevy from a Ford? Can you tell a Rolling Stone song from Loving
Exactly.
Spoonful? And of course they can, because they have a different type of aesthetic appreciation. Maybe it's not a visual aesthetic that way, but they have something else that is aesthetic. And using that aesthetic appreciation or understanding is a doorway. It's a big, wide doorway. And I say it's a big, wide doorway because people are inviting us in to know more about them by painting or making pottery or making.
You go to the entrance of the Buffalo Thunder Sheraton Resort. There is George Rivera's Deer Dancer, right? In
Right,
huge form.
Proportions.
Now that
right.
brings up another question. We're told that the Kachina dolls that you see so frequently, that they're accurate, except there will be missing details or there will be wrong details, so that Native people can share part of their story without it being the full story or the very sacred details, so that it's appropriate to share. So I'm assuming that is true of that giant
Yeah,
statue and everything else, right?
those figures are very complicated.
Yeah.
And I'm just finishing up a book project with a museum that was given, amongst other things, some of those wooden carved figures. And we've gone back to the communities and they've authored sections of writing about those pieces. And for Hopi has a different view of their world and sharing than the Rio Grande Pueblos. So in the Rio Grande Pueblos, you don't see them. I don't see these carved figures. You're not supposed to, but they're there. And I've helped repatriate a few of them. But they're really private. But at Hopi, beginning in probably as early as John Wesley Powell in 1872, he purchased for a quarter, like 5 or 6 of these figures. And so this idea that you could make money on something, much needed money, began to take hold in people. And certainly by 1900, people were making figures for sale. Sometimes they're accurate, sometimes they're not. That's true. There are today there are differences between what is made and what is given to the kids. That's what they're for, instruction. So you receive one of these carved wooden figures. That carved wooden figure has all the details of that dancer or that mass dancer that will come into the village. And it gives a means to begin to learn, again, about people hang them in their house, they have them, it's not something to play with, but they begin to learn about the pantheon of Hopi spiritual beings and where they are, and along with that, all the different contexts of that. So there is a slight difference between what made the tehus, as they're called, as compared to katsina figures or dolls that are sold to the outside world. And there's some appreciation at a place like Hopi, where several people have done this, and they have sold them, but they've also taught a whole world about Hopi that wouldn't know anything about it.
Otherwise,
There is not universal consent for that.
I see.
Let's just say that. And there's not universal consent at Zuni. 2 of our authors wrote about how they were never supposed to be sold. These are the reasons they're not supposed to be sold. And I lament that I'm writing about these figures here and that these were sold in some way. The early people who collected those, the anthropologists who collected those, there's a guy called Stuart Culin, Culin, and he was collecting for the Brooklyn Museum. And he came to Zuni about 1902 for the first time and returned several times after that. And he was clearly interested in these figures. He tried to find them because he felt they were pure forms of culture, that they were more pure than somebody living on that day at Zuni, because they represent a deep system that never changes. All wrong. Let me just say that's all wrong. The only reason why the system still is there because it keeps changing, and in important ways continues to change, and that's why those systems are still there. But when Stuart Culin came back the following year, one of the traders, a white man, had set up Zuni people to make these figures and sell them. So he was able to buy about 100 of these figures at once, all made anticipating Kulin's return to the village. It's complicated. These are such complicated histories and stories. And I think a lot of the work on the museum side of understanding things, because the first question people ask when they walk in collections with you is, how'd this stuff get here? Mm-hmm. So I've spent about 35,000 words in the Sal DeFonso book about how pottery left the village and where it went and why it went those places. It's going to be not just one chapter. It's way too long, but maybe 3 chapters. But that is the question that people always want to know. How did it get here? What did you do to have these things here? So as we bring exposure to those origin stories of museums, I do think more and more better work can happen. There's the playing field, so to speak, is getting more level. It's not level at all, because museums still have the keys. They're still managing the collections. People just can't go anytime. They can't take the pieces home and so forth. But as more conversation happens, you build a mutuality, and people see you. What we want out of what white people are best thinking, in my mind, is we want to be the best stewards possible, to listen to what people want, be able to fulfill those things. If they need to take the piece home for a few weeks, that's fine. I was in Washington, and a community in California wanted to relearn how to make women's dance skirts. So we carefully packed up the dance skirt they wanted to learn from. They asked for a specific dance skirt, and it was carefully packed up so it fit in the overhead, by the way. And I physically took that piece back to the community. I guess I had to change planes someplace, and I stepped out. I had to go back through TSA and screening. So it goes through the X-ray, this box, this strange box, and the guy, the TSA agent, looks at me and goes, "What's this?" He just clearly was confused, and I said, "It's a Chooped woman's dance skirt." Okay, go ahead. It's just too much. It's a little much for him to comprehend.
That brings up a story
was.
that I want to share, a couple stories on this and get your response, because there has been a good role for anthropology collecting this stuff during the chaos. I'm so sad about the chaos and the disruptions of societies. But when we were in Australia, our host, Graham and Shelley, put in a movie, 10 Canoes, and they said, you must watch this. Mm-hmm. And it was a beautiful documentary, historical film, fictionalized, but it was about pulling together a story of the Aboriginal culture before Westerners arrived. And in order to do this, the filmmaker wanted Native people with canoes. They didn't know how to build the canoes. So he went to the anthropology collections, the museum collections, and got a canoe similar to the skirt and brought it back. And then there was a whole workshop in how do we make canoes. We need to make some for this film. We want you to use them. They were delighted. And they continued after an industry in making the native canoes.
The traditional
That was the importance of the film that our host showed us.
Right.
And so I thought, okay, how beautiful that these were preserved and that there's this relearning of an artifact and a lost knowledge. And I won't even begin to tell you about or ask you about private collections and all the artifacts that have shown up in private collections. But I will say that, and I know you had a hand in the Indian art show. So we go to the Indian art show and we see a collection of Mesoamerican artifacts. Beautiful, beautiful Mesoamerican artifacts. We're talking with the gentleman. He's a second generation seller of these artifacts. And we're looking at these and we're asking him questions. And he's telling us the story of how many of the artifacts that he has there for sale, actual ancient artifacts, nobody wants. They're coming back home. That these were sold by his father to collectors, wealthy collectors, and now those collectors have died and their children are inheriting them, and he's getting back the very pieces that his father sold. Why? Because the kids don't want them. They're not meaningful to this new generation. And so they're back up for sale. And he's lamenting the fact that where are these pieces going to go? The collectors are not there. Yeah, there's wealthy kids out there, but this is not what they want. And I've heard the same thing from beautiful used bookstores, important collections of books. They're like, there's nobody collecting the way they used to be. We're getting collections back. Who's going to house these? Where are these collections going to go? There's more than the museum shelves can fill. What's going to happen to this? And this just breaks my heart because, whether it's a museum or back to the culture or where is this stuff going to go? It's precious material. So I just want to put that on your lap and say,
Okay. Well, I share your lament that the materiality of our world, books or objects, is diminishing
yeah.
in some way, and we can easily blame it on social media, where everybody curates himself and has about a 30-second to 1 minute time span of attention span.
Right.
So we could easily just blame it on that, and I think that in many ways that's true. The way that people learn is very different than people of other generations learn. I think that it's sad that bookstores do have so many books, and people aren't collecting books in the way they once did, or using books in the ones that they can read something electronically or read a short synopsis of it. We used to call that Cliff Notes, of course, but you had to buy the Cliff Notes in order to have the copy. Now there's all sorts of things online. If you read something, you want to know something more about it.
I'm talking
But the
about the
physicality,
old historical books of which they're
right?
rare and there's not many copies left and they're really old knowledge and accounts and you're just not going to find them again.
Well, the physicality of things is very evocative, and I think holding those things, looking at them, using those things. Like I'll read, electronically, fiction and the other things I read for pleasure, but anything that has any meaning in my work, I just can't do it that way. I find it very troublesome.
The marginality.
Because there's a physicality to opening the book and seeing that in the Laboratory of Anthropology Museum, the books have been used by different people over the years, sort of famous people for the museum, for the Southwest, Anglo people, not white people, not Native people. And so you open the book and here's a book about this 1932 field work by this person from Columbia, doing this work by Henrietta Burton. And so she interviewed all these people and she talked to people, and then she wrote basically her thesis, and it's published as a book. And one of the people she talked to with Kenneth Chapman, who was the curator at the museum, and he's written all over the book about her mistakes and has added a slip note in the back, typed note. He glued it into the back leaf of the book. Where else can you get that sort of continuity? And we're not talking about native continuity now. We're talking about scholarly work with pottery. Where else can you find that continuity? So if you go on the shelf and you pick up that pot and you turn it over, you see his very distinctive handwriting on the bottom, let's say, and there's something he's written about. You begin to see those stories. So all that physicality, the physicality then of the pot, another predominant physicality is that it's Ignacia Sanchez's pot and what she might have been thinking about, what she's like, and so forth. So there is a lot to the physicality, and I think we're discovering the families don't want their parents' collection, for example.
Or how fragile it is. We had a conversation with a retired professor of music at Washington State University, Laurent Olson. He says, I'm 91 and I have tremendous archives, some on wax cylinders of music, of songs, of the Nez Perce and other tribes. And he's gifting this back to the Nez Perce. He's gifting it back to Wazoo. He's making sure. He was telling us about his other friend, Richard Storch. Huge collection, private collection of early photographs, some of the earliest photographs of natives, and where does this stuff go? Who's going to see it? Who's going to house it? Who's going to caretake it? It's fragile. It's precious.
Well,
it's one of.
I think that's a really important question, and I'm trying to work on that locally. I've always worked on that, and that is, I think these public collections are important. Yes, maybe right now there's not a lot of interest in these historic or contemporary pieces that might go as a gift to the museum. Maybe there isn't, or maybe there isn't much interest in the staff. But can you say what 20 or 30 years down the line would be like? So
Yes.
in my work, I've looked a lot of it 20th century. People discount um, more recent things, thinking they're not authentic from Native people, and that they're not authentic. I just lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. I'll get it back in a moment. I just have to find it. Um, but well, anyways, I'll let that go. I can't remember where I was now.
Let's go take some comments and
We
questions.
can in a few minutes. I was going to also mention, Bruce, on the Institute land where we have the ancestral village, in 1954, there was this archaeological dig. It was the only dig that done at this particular spot of what the Cuyamonga Pueblo space was. And all that material was taken out and put into storage. And I think several years ago, you went back and said, where is this stuff stored? Let's pull these things back out. It doesn't need to be dug up again. We need to go back and look at what was brought out before, because that wasn't even analyzed properly. All that information is there.
Well, there's new tools available, and as you two know, we do nothing that breaks the ground at Cuyamonga. Nothing's intrusive. It's all what's on the ground. So just walking over the site, you can see pottery and other lithics and so forth, and the house mounds that are now just mounds, look like mounds of dirt covered with plants. But there are other things about the village that are really intact. And I always point out to people the shrines that are there. And the reason to point out the shrines is not for people to ooh and ah over them, but really what I want people to think about is that people never abandoned, they never left that place. It is still a Tewa place. And those shrines are the evidence, the clearest, easiest material evidence for us that they're maintained and used still. And I think
Walking with you by one of the shrines, and you pointed out, here's the small round ball that they use to grind in the cupules. There it is. It's still active.
Yeah.
It's a
Well,
rock dust right there.
there's different types of shrines, and that piece you're talking about is a big, large boulder, very distinctive for that side of the village. But walking across Cuyamonga, seeing there's a lot of evidence there. We've used drone photography as another really good tool. We've used undergraduates to count the pottery.
Yeah.
So under the warm summer sun. So we've done a lot of things like that. But we've gone back and looked at the collections that Fred Wendorf was his name, excavated from Cuyamonga. And we've looked at those collections. He only dug in two places. He dug in sort of 1,400 houses and so forth. He didn't know exact dates at that time. And then he dug into the last structure built on site. And both of those give you a lot of information. We know that the largest amount of people who ever lived at Cuyamonga, about 500 people or so, that population began to dwindle about 1400, 1450. And in 1500, there's 200 people. And then there's about 200 and 1600 when the Spanish arrived. And by 1694, no one's living in the village any longer. So the different things that you see, the pottery changes in part of the excavation that we're talking about. They uncovered pieces of bronze bells. Those pieces of bronze bells are church bells that were broken to pieces as the Pueblo people revolted and drove the Spanish out of their homelands. They went and destroyed the mission churches, the churches, and destroyed all the bells. They really felt they wanted to destroy that.
Yeah.
That life that's been forced upon them. And so these pieces of bells are transformed into native things. They no longer stand for the church and calling people to prayer, but they now become part of this world that rejected that type of Catholicism.
Isn't it going to be exciting, the tools that archaeology can employ for the future? I mean, let's leave something there for future archaeologists
Mhm.
with new tools and to go back and examine what we do have. What would you like to see? Where would you like to see archaeology go? You've talked about where the
Anthropology,
human
archaeology.
understanding, the relationship, ethnography, and anthropology. Where do you want to see archaeology go?
Um, well, this is how we're practicing it at Pewaukee. All the questions and things that archaeologists into the work with uh, come from the community. What are they interested in learning about? Why are they interested in learning about those things? Um, so we have a graduate student, for example, writing his PhD dissertation on a different site that's other side of the highway from where you all are. And he needed to go to council to get approval for his project. And it was two different council meetings that finally gave him approval, and they changed his proposal. They didn't want him working on certain things and other things. They're interested in what he's based. The middle part of the work, the core of it, is about typing the clays that he used that are used in the pottery made at that village, and whether they're clays from Four Corners area or they're clays more local. So that'll answer. It's a very, very Chacoan settlement,
Yeah.
and so knowing where the clays come from is going to give a lot of information. You can see, you just imagine all the things that happen once we know that. On the other hand, another graduate student just finished her dissertation. We really wanted to what they call core sample some of the agricultural fields. So on Pewaukee lands, adjacent to Kuyumungi Institute lands, there are agricultural fields. And the core samples are like 6 inches, about an inch by 6 inches. That's all they are. And they just drill down and take that sample out. Then they're sent off for analysis to look at what's in there, the types of seeds and pollens that are existing in there. And so Caitlin did this for some of these agricultural fields. She did a sample. You can't tell where she did this. It's not really ground disturbing in the sense it's just a small round hole. But out of that, she was able to establish that cotton was being grown there, a little tiny bit of corn, but mostly cotton are grown in those fields. And so she had the people who did the analysis then from the University of Alabama, they came out and they said, there's no way cotton could grow here. There's not one piece of the condition here that would allow cotton to grow. And that's great to have that science. But people 800 years ago, 500, 800 years ago, Kuyumungi already answered that scientist. They showed the scientist that you could grow cotton by creating mulch fields, stone, little pebble, stone mulch fields. So throughout the whole village settlement, kind of on the, not where the village is, but out all around it are these fields that are what we call mulch fields. And the mulching is done with stones or rocks. And so those rocks come from someplace, and those rocks are they're just little pebbles. I really just mean that, but they heat the ground, they hold the moisture in the ground, so they allow a rapid germination and continued germination for the cotton plants that grows a little bit quicker. It grows a little bit quicker because of the heat generated and the moisture retention. And if we walk around, one more thing, Laura, as we walk around and look at Kuyumungi, we see those lines, and we see that in those fields, we're still looking for a cotton plant. We haven't found one, but in those fields are pinon trees. So here in the Southwest, we were basically in a pinon juniper area where the Kuyumungi Institute is and where the village is. And junipers can grow any place. You got to be really careful. They just grow like quick and easy. And then, but pinons are very complicated to grow and much more difficult. But
And they're food stuff too.
and there are people eat the juniper berries as well. But yes, absolutely, pinons have the nuts on them. But those pinons that are beginning to grow back now are in these fields, are right on the border rocks of these fields. It's really quite amazing to see that the regeneration of the trees and so forth, and the active usefulness of these fields. It has not diminished.
I appreciate Louis Henna of the Tasuki tribe, who gave us a tour and was pointing out the terracing.
Hmm.
He was pointing out the depression, and he would say, "You folks build up, we built down. Do you know why?" He said in the winter with snow that they had the whole families out there rolling snowballs onto their planting fields to help add water. He was saying that the small rocks, the big rocks of the mulch beds where the rocks absorb the heat and give it out, the small rocks were brought up from the river by children, the larger rocks by the men. It was a family, it was a community affair to create these agricultural fields. And he would say to us, "You call it permaculture today, we call it the old ways." And I appreciate how he showed us his own experimental fields. And he was saying that even the people from South America, Peru, elders he was collaborating with to bring back their really extensive, deep knowledge of agriculture, of hybridization. And let us not forget that so many of the foodstuffs that we have are that heritage from native peoples of the Americas. So many of that, the brilliance. I read a story where somebody was saying that when the Spaniards came, I believe this was in South America, they would come in and they saw llamas or wool animals, wool producing animals, I don't know, llamas, whatever they were, and they immediately think meat and go and kill them, and the people were horrified. Why? Because these were so carefully bred generation after generation for their wool, which was so fine that you could have a huge shawl and you could pass it through a small ring, right? That was the heritage. Those were the, quote, artifacts, the knowledge base of these people. So I think so much of the legacy of these tribes the world over, but particularly for the Americas, was in, just as you're saying, the foodstuffs, the hybridization. We met people who were collecting seeds that were drought resistant. We also, Roxanne Swensel's is a good example. And if you're ever in the Post Center, go around the corner to her beautiful tower gallery and listen to her and watch her films and look at her beautiful artifacts. But she's talking about re-educating her pueblo for the native foodstuffs that they thrive on, as opposed to, of course, the Western diet, which nobody thrives on. So I think that's also a legacy, the corn, bean, and squash and their knowledge. So I just want to bring that as well, that we are participating in the legacy of these native peoples just for the foodstuffs alone. This is one of the heritage, one of the legacies, the drought-resistant seeds, that deep knowledge of how to work a land, appreciate a land. Louis Hanna also stood on the Cuyamonga village site, and he said, "You asked me what the heritage of these people is? Look at this entire valley. The floor, our church, this is our home, the entire valley. The mountains are the walls. The sky is the ceiling." And I think also that perspective, Bruce, is something that is so informative to us today, we Westerners, to think of being at home on the landscape, to think of being at home in our universe, to think of being at one with Mother Earth, to think of all of life as sacred, and this as being our home, as opposed to waking up in a room, in a house, in a city, in a county, in a state, in a country, these false boundaries that are put on ourselves, right? But just to be at home with nature and Mother Earth. That is what I want to hear more from the worldview. I think for us to revisit what it is to be human, let's look at our ancestors who did so successfully. I'm talking about the world over. What are the principles, the values? How can we be better stewards to one another, right? And to our communities and we have so much to learn. And so, yes, the cultural artifacts tell a story, but I want to hear more from the people themselves and their worldview. I don't want to just turn to a book. I want to hear from them. And you promised us that you would bring this summaries my point. You promised us that you would bring some Native elders to us that we could chat with and share with our community here. So
Sure.
I look forward to that, Bruce.
Yeah. Well, you've given great evidence for why listening in touring the village with Louis is a lot better than walking around with me. It's just how he sees and feels something about that place that we can articulate in other ways. For example, if you stand at Cuyamonga, you can see all the major villages on Milwaukee's lands. So it's very important. There's a connectiveness of that place.
I would say
And that
Tewa lands
connectiveness,
because there's the Nambe and there's the Tsuke and there's
yeah,
the Pohake tribe. Let's include everybody there. Yeah.
right. Well, I understand. Tsuki is oriented looking the south towards the Galisteo Basin. Nambe is an interesting place. It's looking down the river towards the Jemez. And San Ildefonso is the other place. They're looking up the river towards Nambe, or they're on the river, but their real view shed is to the Pajarito Plateau, just the mountains in front of the Jemez Range, where the national labs at Los Alamos is located. When you're standing at Cuyamonga, you can look north, you can look south, you can look west. You can't see a lot east because of the way the mountains set when you get to the arroyo back there. But you certainly can have a lot of vistas. And each one of those vistas is incredibly important to understanding. And as you walked up that hillside with Louis, you went through those first fields and how water is conducted onto the fields and so forth. You walk up that trail, up the spine of that hill, and you see all these other fields. And when you get to the top of that ridge, you get to the top, and up there then is a spot to sit and contemplate. There's a place built to do that, to be thankful for what's going on in those agricultural fields. So there is that, and I think the broader consciousness that someone like a travel member presents is absolutely true. It's all theirs. We're just living on it, voyeurs at time, unfortunately. So being more respectful is incredibly important. I don't think, I know some people think about turning the clock back, changing things, but I think that.
I think about pulling that wisdom going forward, that we
I
have
think
a
that's a
large
better.
tapestry, and today we need all the wisdom at hand. Collectively, we need to be one family again, moving forward.
Right.
We have a question from Todd Van Poel.
Oh,
And thank you, Bruce, for taking Todd and Christine on the tour of that
Oh,
week
sure.
when they visited us. Yeah. Hey, Todd.
Hey, Bruce.
Hey,
Thank
Todd.
you. It's good to see you. How are you doing?
Fine. How are you?
I'm enjoying it. I wish we were still there in New Mexico, able to go and see the both beautiful landscape, but also enjoy the food there.
Okay.
One of the things I've noticed, so I've been working in the Southwest long enough to start to see some changes. I've been kind of working with Native groups for probably 30 years now. One of the things I've see that's different now than it used to be is when I'm dealing with a lot of the artists, the artisans. A lot of the art shows a greater combination, a greater synthesis between different artistic traditions of different groups. And so a couple of years ago, when we were in the Southwest, we were talking to somebody down in Albuquerque, there on the plaza there in the old town of Albuquerque. And he was talking about how he had integrated both Navajo and Zuni designs into a single piece that we were looking at because he was both Navajo and Zuni, and that meant something to him. And I don't remember seeing that in the past as much when I was working on the Zuni reservation. And of course, I was actually on the Zuni reservation then, so I might not have seen it. But even when I was in Santa Fe or in Albuquerque, I didn't see as much sort of the combination of the synthesis amongst different tribal traditions. Is that true? Is there kind of a movement towards a greater individual synthesis or expression? Or is that just something I saw in a couple of cases and I'm generalizing?
You've asked two. Hey, Todd, you've asked two separate questions. I just want to point that out. Nice try.
You bet.
I think one issue is about the individualization of Native arts. That is, and the other question is about, is there more interaction? And so let me start with the more interaction with potters and others. That there's far more mobility today. People go to boarding schools and meet their husbands and wives there. And so there's much more, people are from multiple places, their heritage is multiple. That always existed. There's no problem with that. That has never not been that way. There are people who are Dene or Navajo and Isleta in Milwaukee's bloodlines. And you'll find a lot of Milwaukee people at as far south as Santo Domingo, as well as the other Tewa villages. So this idea of mixing and so forth, we, the outsiders, thank you, anthropologists, have given us this idea that the villages are hermetic, and they're self-contained. And what Cuyamonga shows us, Laura just was talking about as well, is a broader world. It's a world where things are brought in and taken out. And I think that's really important to remember. Alfonso Ortiz, he said that, Spanish came and somehow people think the world stopped and everything was changed with the Spanish. For us, meaning Pueblo people, Alfonso wrote that it's really more that it was just another type of change, that we took in or rejected certain things. And you can see how people do that as a process. So again, Pueblos are strong because they've always recognized the need to continually hold themselves together by absorbing some things and rejecting others. And people bring things in and then they push them out. Wheat is a perfect example of that people stopped growing wheat in the 20th century for different reasons, where they had started it, a couple of centuries before that. The individualization, this is complicated, I will say that. And it's the reason why with my native authors, we stopped our San Ildefonso book in 1930. Because the idea that you're making something that belongs to the community as compared to a signature on the bottom, that you're making money from it, means it's more competitive because more individual. You begin to develop an individual style. People always had individual hands, and the same polychrome pot we made by 5 different people, and each of those pots are different because of the person's ability, their creativity, what they see, and so forth. But they fit a pattern that we can still say they're from San Ildefonso or they're from Milwaukee.
I don't see how an artist couldn't put themselves into their art. Even Thomas Wynne last week was saying that when you look at a collection of hand axes and you see that they were identifying, this was what, 500,000 years ago, they were identifying specific artists within a collection.
Well, a person's hand
signature was there.
Yeah,
Couldn't help
that same water jar has different hand signatures on it. Yeah, I think it's absolutely right that we can learn to see people named or unnamed, but sometimes it can be in the pottery side. I will say sometimes it's deceiving and picking out whether it's this guy or that guy can be very, very difficult. And part of that is that families hold things and teach one another things. So the individualization, let's go back to individualization just a bit. What the marketplace, led by Indian Fair, beginning in 1922, now called Indian Market, began to do was asking people for signatures. And the idea was that the signatures would authenticate the pot. It's also because many of the Anglos couldn't tell one person from another or be able to identify one pot from another, so they could turn it over. And if you watch people now, which is an unfortunate thing, is the first thing people do is they turn it over to see whose the pot is. Or they test them. People love to test themselves. Oh, that must be a blue corn pot. Turn it over, wrong. Why is it a blue corn pot? Well, it's one of her daughters. Or totally wrong, it's another family completely. But people kind of test themselves and their knowledge with those signatures. So people used to fire together, get clay together and so forth. But now with individualization, because all their livelihood is invested in making pottery, there's not as much sharing. There's still some sharing, but there's not as much. Potters before this, in the 20th century, is very difficult for Pueblo people. Drought, pestilence, encroachment of water and land rights. The period between 1910 and 1912, 1911 in particular, as the laws are going to change how Pueblo lands as Indian tribes was going to be protected or it was going to be changed, but anybody sitting on that land or working that land meant it was theirs. So people began to take their water out of irrigation. They began to just put houses and fields wherever they wanted. That wouldn't be resolved for
So much
another.
disruption. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that wouldn't be resolved for. It's still being worked out. Let me just put it that way. It's very complicated. So the individualization, though, is driven by that people can't go back to farming because there's nothing they can really farm. Very complicated. So their sole source of income is making the pottery. So people become more protective of their abilities and so forth. And we know names of potters for the last 100 years. But I would challenge you, Todd. You know any potters' names from 1880 or 1900? So part of our work in this tome is to people to see these known people and what it means about those known people, and give some voice to those people and their influence in the village for pottery.
So much that goes into this, doesn't it? Isn't it? Yeah.
And Christine, did you want to have a follow-up question as well? And we also want to add. I want to also add in Lauren Olson to the discussion as well.
Because we just mentioned you, Lauren.
Yeah, he's a professor emeritus from Washington State University on Music and Native American Studies.
Yeah.
Don't know if he knows how to turn on his camera or whatever. I had you in, but yeah, Christine asked you a question too.
Oh, I don't really have a question. Just this is wonderful. Thank you, Bruce. And I like to think that archaeology over the last 20 years is slowly improving. Most archaeologists, as you know, because of working with Scott Ortman, that many of us are really thinking about the things you raised with thinking about materiality and the meaning of the artifacts. But often many of us realize it's really that process of creating these things that is where the knowledge is and the cultural overlays and the shifting in cultures. But anyway, I really liked what you had to say about all that. I think that many of us are attempting to do that, maybe not as well as we could, but I have other questions for you. We can have it. Hopefully I'll see you again in the near future and we can have more conversation because I love pottery. Obviously we have a few pieces of pottery behind us, but we have some old pieces and they're not signed. But yeah, so you were joking about, can you name some old potters? Like, no, because when you flip them over, there's no name on them, right? But it's just a wonderful journey in the Southwest. But anyway, we'll talk more, and I'll thank you again.
Sure.
Thank you, Christine and Todd.
Oh, don't go away.
Well, I'm going to also add Frederick Smith on.
Oh.
He has a question. Fred is a Southeastern Studies professor and
Vedic scholar.
Vedic scholar, we say.
Yeah, I was at the University of Iowa for many decades, now retired. I'm from Santa Fe and I'm back in Santa Fe now. And I've been familiar with, pottery of this area since I was born, because my mother was a pediatrician in Santa Fe and she used to be given pieces of pottery she took care of 5 of the pueblos in north of Santa Fe for free for about 35 years. Wow. And instead of paying her, they would give her pottery. So we have a lot of pottery that was signed beginning in the 1950s by people who later became very well known. And this whole process of individualization rather, has always interested me because somewhere I read, maybe at the Folk Art Museum, at the Museum of Anthropology here in Santa Fe, that the first pots created in the Southwest that did not hold water and were not intended to hold water was in the 1880s. And this has always been interesting to me that these wouldn't be signed, but that the notion of community property rather than private property, a community rather than the individual, there seemed to be a transformation that went on between about the 1880s and the 1920s or 30s. I'm not sure I'm reading that properly, so I just wonder whether the notion of private property and then the notion of signatures was something that...
Yeah, well, I do think you're reading it properly. And a lot of people tie that 1880 date to the railroad arriving, the availability of manufactured goods. And there's no doubt about that, except that 1880, when you look at Jack Hiller's photographs of San Alfonso, everybody has doors and windows already. So it wasn't the train that brought those. The people already had some access, and they liked those things. And we're no different, you know. So we're allowed to. So that I always try and talk about it this way: that we as white people are allowed to change and transform our lives and move around and so forth. But we're still who we are. Well, Pueblo people like change. They like new things. They like old things, and they move around, but they always come home. They come home for a feast day, or they come home to live after they're dissatisfied elsewhere or at retirement and so forth. So there's always this movement. The 1880s, there's a generation of potters in 1880s working, and they are community-based potters. They don't sign anything, but their hand is like, wow, this is Potter X, you know. Wow, that's just her work. She's such a good potter. And here are a set of people trying to paint like her, to make a pot like her. They're not achieving the same high level. So we know that. And the marketplace. So we're not going to do this today, but the marketplace and selling pottery and working with the museum in the 1910, 1920 really focused on the individual. So there's a famous story about the head of the museum in the School for Advanced Research here in Santa Fe. Edgar Hewitt is his name. And Hewitt had the opportunity to work with people who were born long ago or a shorter time frame. And he always chose one or two people to work with. He never worked beyond those two people. He didn't work with their mothers. He didn't work with their fathers and aunts and uncles and so forth. So everybody depended on one person to describe and create an image of San Ildefonso. And that still goes on in the sense of any village. You know, that Laura mentioned the name of someone who we all went out and has been in Cuyamonga quite a bit. And he is not a spokesperson for his village. He's just a person in that village. And people are very careful about how they exist. So that person is part of the community of where he's from. Other people are like just on the fringes selling, as you're suggesting. It's a lovely story about your mother too, being a pediatrician and working with different people.
Yeah. I mean, it was interesting for me also to hear about you talking about the intermarriage between like I think you pointed out Navajo and Zuni. Of course, that's that has to have happened over the years. And there's been a lot of question in the art world now that if it's a Zuni piece like a Kachina created by a Navajo, then it's not like genuine.
Right.
And you can talk to any of these shops in downtown Santa Fe and they will tell you that there's a genuine. And I say, well, how do you know that they're not intermarried? And they would say they wouldn't know how to answer a question like that.
Right.
So the art market is kind of driven by this whole question of homogeneity in a way.
Yeah, well, I think the market, a lot of my work is trying to untie some of those knots. So you walk into those stores in Santa Fe. There's a type of store here in Santa Fe for the rest of you that is Middle Eastern in origin, either Palestinian or Jordanian. No one's quite sure. And all the stores have the same things in them.
Yeah.
And most of it, if not all of it, is made elsewhere. Yet they're supposed to be representing Native people. So there is this tremendous amount of jewelry and other things that goes into those stores. The fact that Navajo people, make these figures of great lament by Pueblo people, they feel it's just basically wrong. I mean, but Pueblo people tend to be accommodating, and there's not going to be a movement, but they are labeled differently now. That's true. They're no longer labeled as Kachina dolls or whatever, but I think they're called wooden figures. You see them. I've forgotten the exact terminology. And this question of surely with traditional arts comes up. So if somebody has modern tools are very welcome. So somebody has a truck, and they take that truck and they, instead of walking to where the clay is. They drive in the truck. It's a quick journey. They can load the back of the truck up with clay, and they come home. Now, if we were walking that route, let's say we were walking from the house. So a friend told me this not too long ago. So he'd go out with his aunt, and they would talk the entire way to the clay gathering spot. So that observation, living the culture, some of that is just spoken about as you're walking along in a very natural way, not forced at all. And then, there's certain things that happen. If you're going to carry that clay back, you're not going to carry 5 bags, that's for sure. But you're going to carry what you can carry on your person. So that changes a bit. So you get some change in terms of things like that. Now with that, so people tolerate that. They've been using trucks for a long time. But if that same truck went by the clay collecting spot and went into Santa Fe and bought clay already made, that's a different use of the truck. That's a problem in terms of if the person sells it as Pueblo pottery or the dealer gallery represents it as Pueblo pottery, only in the sense that it needs to be talked about, that this person goes out and purchases their clay and then builds these pieces and fires an electric kiln, as compared to somebody who gathers their clay and their temper and mix it together and builds the pot and fire it outdoor. Exponentially more complicated. But the shorter route, as you're saying, Rick, is what is driven by money. And there are many people in the communities are very aware of what we're talking about and looking for ways to solve that. But people do need to make a living. If you cut all those people off, you cut the native side of the equation off, it would be very difficult. Now, we could cut out those stores and the fake stuff in there and the way they sell. And that would be good. There's 87 of those stores in Santa Fe right now.
87?
87.
Man, you got a census going.
Well, and so, but is Santa Fe really, or the state really interested in doing something about this? I was on a governor's commission a little while back now, maybe about 10 years ago. We got to the committee hearing and so forth, and it just died. We were looking at ways to regulate on a state level, to regulate the Indian art business. And so one of the things we talked about, was like bakeries and hairdressers and so forth have a rating system. So I'm sure a group would get together and just rate the stores. Now, some stores would not want to be rated, but buyer beware, right? They don't have the rating on their door. You can't see it. People start asking for it through a brochure because people ground up. I think Laura Lee's talking about with consciousness building. It's got to be ground up that people are rising up.
Santa Fe is already very keen on that. That's why they have the Folk Art Festival, where you've got the artisans themselves dressed in their native garb from all over the world that come and sell the wares that they themselves made. You've got the Governor's Palace, the lineup of the native artists right there. You can see them, talk to them about a piece if you want.
But
right?
still,
So there's ways for tourists to.
There are ways, and I think you're absolutely right about things.
Yeah.
Okay, so you go under the portal, which is the front of the Palace of the Governors. People don't know that. And there's about 50 artists, as many as 80 artists in there. And you buy something from that person. Let's say it's $5, and you go across the street to one of those stores facing those people sitting under the portal, and you find a similar piece or the same piece replicated, and it's half that price. Because people are driven by money in the equation, they want the half the price thing. They don't see the difference of being handmade, made by that person, as compared to the store that's
There is
carrying
a difference. You're
things that are
talking to
replicated.
the person,
That's what
they're
he's
telling
saying.
you
That's
the
what he's
story. You go to the Folk Art Festival, you see, right? So
Right. There's a real
something
value
in
to
the
buy.
experience.
There's an
Yeah.
absolute value to buy from people directly. There's a really amazing, it's an amazing circumstance.
An exchange.
I mean, can you really say with certainty that everything that they sell under the Palace of the Governors is truly made by those people?
Well, you're asking another question. Well, I'm going to leave that alone. I'm sorry.
That'd be a case.
I'm going to
like
leave that
this
alone
thing,
today
you can only
because
say,
they have a committee that juries people who are in. They are supposed to make it, our close family members. It's supposed to be made in certain authentic ways. Jewelry and pottery have a lot of rules associated with them, those rules are part of the way that the world has thought about those things. And trying
Or
to
else
translate into
disclose
English
it.
is very complicated.
Yeah.
That they do become like, it looks like the museum is telling people what to make. No, there's a portal committee and everything else.
Oh,
And whatever
God.
people sell and stuff. Another day we could walk over there and talk about that. It's an awfully complicated, and you don't want to deny those people a livelihood.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, even Roxanne Swinzel, in her film, she will say, I used to go out and collect the clay, go to the source of the clay, collect it. Now I just buy it. So she's fully admitting it. But she's also not producing pieces in authentic, traditional Pueblo. She's doing art.
Contemporary authentic.
She's, well, I mean, she's authentic, but I mean, she's using contemporary. She's not following the old patterns, right? So I
Right.
think, yeah,
Okay.
art. But look at her prolific output. I mean, she would spend all her time with the amount of stuff that she produces harvesting clay. I mean,
Makes sense.
and what's wrong with an artist making that choice for themselves and just
Well, like you said,
disclosing it?
pickup truck versus
Yeah.
There's no problem at all with people making choices, and we celebrate those people. Like you're talking about Roxanne right now, we celebrate their great artistic vision, and it makes no difference that where she gets her clay, but she's very clear about it.
Yeah,
She
that's what I'm
knows
saying.
she knows that, and her pieces are killed and fired. So her contemporary pieces are autobiographical,
And
very
tell a
often,
story.
and they tell a story. So she's got a piece that's telling a story.
Different intent.
And so it's pottery like, but we're not talking about it in the same vein as pottery. And it's amazing what people will do. I wrote an article about people sitting in booths for 2 days before the artist arrives at Indian Market to buy something from the artist. So I befriended this group on a Thursday. This was about 15 years ago, and I began to talk to them and returned and talked to them each year for a while. And they were waiting for Roxanne. And the first, no one had a cell phone. A few years later, everybody has a cell phone, including Roxanne. So people know that Roxanne's on the highway, almost arriving in Santa Fe. And so this group of about 10 people have chase lounges. They order food. You have to stay. They have their own set of rules.
Make it a party.
Well, as much as they can. Yeah. And one of the things that happens is that Roxanne shows up. So one of the things, Roxanne shows up and they have an order already established, one at a time, goes into the booth with Roxanne and gets some private time with Roxanne and decides what they want to buy or not buy. People could wait all night. And the piece they wanted, because their fourth one in is already gone, they'll walk away. I did ask this one guy who was a collector from elsewhere, and I asked him, why are you doing this? You could just go in the gallery and buy a piece, or you could order it directly from her. Because it just wouldn't be the same. So his authenticity is generated about how he purchases directly from her and at Indian Market. So it's an important piece of his relationship with her.
Yeah. I think Christine.
I just want to add one little thing.
Go ahead, Fred.
You turned off your
That
camera.
is oh, my camera.
You're okay.
It's on.
Now it's on.
You're okay.
Okay. Yeah, and that is that, Bruce, I just asked my brother, Andrew Smith, whether he knew you. And and he said, yeah, you're a really smart guy and done some stuff together, and he praised you. Just wanted to tell you that.
Oh, thanks. I didn't realize you're Andy's brother.
Yeah. Okay.
But the pediatrician thing, now I'm thinking, okay. So
Okay, Fred. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Small world. And Chris, you had your hand up to add something? Yeah.
When is your book coming out?
yeah,
Oh, that's a good point.
next summer. I've got the
Good.
The manuscript is I have one little section to write. You'll appreciate this as an archaeologist. I have to describe what pottery, like 4 types of pottery from 1600 to about 1760, 80, what they are, what they look like. That is the only section not written. And I just have a great amount of resistance. I can do everything else in the meantime, finish some other things, garden like crazy, but just sitting down to write probably 2 pages about Cuyamonga Sea, Tewa polychrome, Sankawi, maybe glazewares. I haven't decided if I want glazewares or not there. but just these styles that people are practicing as the Spanish entered the Southwest. What are the people's styles? Of course, Tewa polychrome is a style about 1620 or so. It's created. Capo or blackware is another style in response to the Spanish. And then the change in the middle part of the 18th century are with these large bowls and storage jars having to do with wheat agriculture in the communities.
Right. I'm not much of a typologist. I mean, I'll do it when I have to, and it's an important part of our job. But things like this fascinate me, and so I'm looking forward to your book. I teach ceramic analysis here at the University of Missouri, and of course, we have the research reactor, so we can source clay here, and we have a strong scientific perspective in our anthro. But things like this fascinate me.
Look at that.
Yeah, and so this is a project I've been wanting to do for over 20 years. Of course, I know what these are, and I know the family relationship and different generations are depicted here. But what I really love is the technology and all the stuff on the back end that myself as a scientist cannot know because of the story. So you talked about where they go and collect the clay and the time where people are talking to each other, the stories. And what I always wanted to do was a family study of things like this. So it sounds like you're kind of doing that already. What did she tell her grandkid? And what did the grandkid learn from her? And how is this knowledge incorporated into this piece? And what stories was grandma told to granddaughter? And how did that all intertwine? So we as people that love pottery and anthropologists, or even somebody within this family set, understand and negotiate with that material. But those are the type of questions I just find absolutely fascinating. So I'm really looking forward to your book, because this is something that these two pieces have called to me for 20 years about. Let's really explore those back behind the scenes and the stories, the beliefs, and how it engages with the material. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely. Yes.
It makes a lot of sense, yes. And I think that working with individual families and family like you're showing has a lot of depth to it. And there's differences of opinion about how pots should look and so forth. All that's worked out.
Right.
The dynamics of the family are worked out through continuing Maria and Julian Martinez's legacy.
Yeah, and that's exactly what you're looking at, one of those, yeah. And then Dunlap is the other one, but yeah. And so I always tell my students, but this is my perspective. I have people walk in my office all the time and say, is this valuable? And is this somebody? I said, I don't know. And I'll do that. I'll say, even if I do know, I'll say, I don't know. And what do you think about it? Does it speak to you? What do you think about it? Don't worry about the name on the bottom who made it. I don't know. That's just me about if you're going to be going to Santa Fe. I get the story you tell, because when I go into the Southwest, and even being from New Mexico, I've always preferred to be on the plaza in the Pueblo. Or when we worked out at Zuni, I like going and being there and buying individually. And then I love going as a tourist to any one of the markets. And I'll be looking at something, and I always find that somebody starts telling me these great stories. And then when I buy a piece, I'll try to remember to write all those stories down and put it now in the pottery when I remember to, because a lot of it's the engagement. And it's amazing how, like you said, how generous the Pueblo people are. They'll just tell you all kinds of neat things. I don't know. It's just it's such a joy. But I love your approach, and I would love to talk more about your approach and how to maybe someday in all my spare time really looking at, I don't know if I want to do the family I just showed, but some type of family looking at those dynamics through times would be just really fascinating.
That's
I
great.
want to talk
Thanks
about
for
another
coming.
way, and Christine, stay on. I want to talk about another way in which stories have been so meaningful. We interviewed an archaeologist who was looking at tsunamis on the West Coast, and looking and going to the natives and saying, what are your stories? What are your stories about and they had stories, and those stories helped them pinpoint, and they could verify the legends, the myths, whatever you want to call them, for those native people, because they found the evidence of the tsunamis in those village sites. So, historically also, the stories are very important. and help.
And how they documented it. Yeah.
Yeah.
They
So,
both geologically aligned with the stories.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, did you have a response, Bruce? And then I have one more question, and I want you, my advisors, Todd and Christine, to stay with us for a minute. So,
Okay.
here's my last question. You talked about consciousness. Here we have our Western worldview, which really sees the world, the physical world as we see it, and that's about it. And then we have the Native people who see consciousness deeper, a larger picture, who really see consciousness, the agency of the spirit of a piece, its purpose. I mean, there's so much more. Can we really understand from the Western perspective all that the Native people have to share without including and not dismissing that aspect of the worldview?
Mm-hmm.
How can we truly,
Yeah.
I mean, there are those of us who are already like, I'm right there because that's my experience of the world. But then we have Westerns, you talk about integrating it. Can we truly integrate without accepting all that they have to share from that perspective? Talking about Indigenous people worldwide, because they all seem to share that.
Well, I think that really good question. I think certain Anglos or white people, outsiders to Native communities, are built to understand, just have an ability to, because they've questioned something about themselves. But the question because we've been talking about Pueblo people, is whether or not people have the patience to learn over time and not be shown or handed a piece of paper with the points on you're supposed to learn. But it's really about observation and enveloping you and pulling you towards this greater understanding. People will never tell you everything. I think it's very important to know. And even if you were a member of that village, certain people know things and they don't tell other members of the village. So knowledge by itself, there's no whole piece of knowledge, a core that people can look at and work from, but rather it's placed with a few people who share that, and they develop. They have younger people coming along who are working with them all the time. So as they go out, it's not mysterious. They go out and collect evergreen boughs, Douglas firs, before certain dances. Know what's going on in the truck while they're walking around and collecting these tree branches and so forth. There's a lot of talk about, do you know why we use these, or this is what we're going to do? I remember, 10 years ago we did X. So all of that is part of the learning process. There's nothing that's not learning about it. So we're not really offered those opportunities in a matter of speaking. I have gone out, cut wood with the guys I work with who are religious leaders, and I have done that. And it's sort of the native learning. What we're doing is obscured. We buy where we could go to lunch. You put gas in the truck, things like that. But even in going to lunch or where that's chosen to go to, there's certain native qualities about that place where people like to eat. It's kind of a knowable thing. So again, it's about hearing people, taking the time to listen, but to really try and understand.
Okay, that was not my last question. This is my last question.
Right.
Wait a
Christine
second.
and Todd, you were training the next generation of anthropologists. And Bruce, you have helped the Pueblo people have more access to their ancestral heritage. How are those young people changed by this knowledge? How are young people today embracing all of this shift and embracing, knowing, seeing the larger perspective, stepping outside just the Western culture,
question, yeah.
but also,
Yeah.
Can all three of you speak to how is the young generation taking to this, and where are they going to go with it, do you think?
Who are you going to call
Bruce?
first?
Bruce, do you want to go first?
Oh, okay, sure. Well, my opportunity to work with younger people is mentoring people in museums, for example. There's several people that I've been working with that are aware of the type of work that I've done and that they're continuing that work in one way or another, or building on it. What I really want to see them build on it, and not just to take something, but make it their own. And I think that's really important. How do they, so if I can help them by talking about how to make it their own, hey, I want to try it this way, or so tell me what you're doing so I can understand better. Those types of conversations are important. And as a lot of the younger generation going to museums say, well, it's good the old generation's passing by, or getting out of this, retiring, so we can have these new ideas. But without mentoring those people and having those other ideas, those museum people today are just like other museum people. I don't think there's substantial difference. They're unwilling to change. They're willing to think about changing attitudes, but they're more interested in writing a paper about their experience than making change, doing the change. As far as archaeology, the aspiration is you work with Native people, and we had the field school here for a number of years from the University of Colorado, and we set them up certainly to count sherds and do some of the work like that and record sites, but also last year we had a few years just pre-pandemic, we instead of them carrying around food and so forth, we hired one of my friends in the Pueblo, and she made these 10 kids from University of Colorado breakfast and lunch breakfast and dinner every day. So she got 10 new grandchildren out of it. Let me just put it that way. It was really a wonderful experience. So that might be the only experience they have with a Native person. So how do you make it comfortable? And over food, everything becomes very comfortable and easy.
Makes sense. Yeah.
So she was a great addition to the program. She did something, inviting people into her home that we couldn't do separately. And I've done that in a number of places in a number of ways. So this younger generation needs to work, be collaborative. I think there's been enough excavation. The museum in Mexico, where the Cuyamangay things have 40,000 boxes of archaeology and that are unprocessed. So the Cuyamangay, as an example, is not processed. It is not really written about. So there's certain aspects of it. I've described the bells. There's also in that collection European style soup bowls. And I think Cuyamangay was the center for creating those soup bowls for a lot of reasons. I think it's an important part of their taking a Tewa form like pottery and their clays and so forth, and making a bowl that the Spanish would be interested in having in their homes and using.
Yeah.
So I think there's a generation sitting out there just waiting for instruction and to work like that.
And Todd,
what do you find with your students?
I teach in this course. The name of the course that I came in on is North American Indians and Culture. And when I teach that class, people really, the young people, not all, but a lot of people want to engage with, Native American voices. They want to learn about the voices, and they're really wanting to know how to do that. And sometimes I had a young one a younger student who is also a journalism student, and she was hired to cover the Wind River reservation. And the first thing I suggested to my young student was check in with the tribal authority, check in with the tribal offices, introduce yourself, ask appropriate questions, who they might want for her to talk to, and how to start building that relationship. Because obviously we can't know everybody across North America. It's just hard. How do you start the engagement? Where do you start? And even I sometimes wonder, where do we start? And when I have a student say, oh, I'm going to cover the Wind River Reservation, I'm like, that's awesome. Now, let's see how we can help you do that a better job for both the newspapers, but also for the people that live on the reservation. And those are interesting questions. I would have invited Bruce for any suggestions he might have as somebody who has walked that walk too.
Yeah.
I appreciate when a museum gives me the audio, the film, the story, and there is a Native speaker telling those stories. Mm-hmm. If I can't have access right directly face to face, at least have the voice, and I'll sit there and watch that film and take it in. Mm-hmm. I appreciated the Museum of Musical Instruments in Phoenix. We thought we'd go there for all day, because we had to listen to every song as we're gazing upon the artifacts. the audio is so important to go with the visual for that, and just there's so much there in the voice. So I'm looking forward to talking with you, Lauren. There's so much in all of the culture as cultural containers, as conveyors. And what I truly appreciate about the art and the artifacts is it tells its story across the ages, across the generations. It is there speaking to us in a language more deep than just the verbal, right? The visual, just the symbols, the iconography, the materials, just so much to be decoded for those stories. They're so rich. So I appreciate what museums are and what museums are becoming. Again, I see them as modern day cathedrals.
Yeah.
So, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Todd and Christine, for being our advisors all these years.
Yeah.
Thank you, Fred, for being our advisor. Yeah. Thank you, Bruce, for being our friend and advisor to our neighbors.
To our land,
yeah, to our land.
Yeah.
Thank you for all the work that you do. And again, boy, for someone to come into museums and help shape them for the future over the last 30 years with your perspective and sensitivity and desire to listen to the very people that you're representing.
You know, we've kind of come to a crossroads in human history, and there's been these different branchings off, this division, but we're coming back around where we're saying we need to listen to every voice we can hear, because in order for us to navigate the waters ahead, it looks like there's some rough waters, and it takes a village, as it's been said before. It takes all of us together to gather together in our energy. So having the Indigenous voice, having the voice of the traditional people, and then looking back at the ancestral histories of all of us, and looking for that wisdom that comes down through human history, more important than ever, I think, to be able to embrace that and find
the eternal wisdom, the eternal principles, the stuff that actually helped you thrive and survive.
Yeah.
To its holistic form.
So that's it, Bruce.
Okay,
congratulations.
Final
2
words.
hours.
Thank you. 2 hours and 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bruce.
My pleasure. It's nice spending the morning with you too and everybody else. And I really appreciate what you do at the Institute. Thank you.